Welcome back, everyone. Today we continue our conversation on the future of supply chains with our partner, Mirko Senatore. Thank you for joining us again, Mirko.
Thanks, Victoria. Thanks for inviting me again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. As I mentioned, today we will focus on the next chapter of supply chain transformation. And let's start with like a more bigger picture. A few years ago, supply chain transformation was mostly talked about through the lens of digitalization, moving away from the manual processes, creating more visibility across the systems. And today, I believe it feels like the conversation is evolving in something much deeper. So, what do you think fundamentally has changed compared to the a few years ago? Is it still about the digitalization, or are we entering some kind of new, different phase altogether?
Yeah, Victoria, I think we are definitely entering a different phase. Somehow, I think we are already in a different phase. Maybe not everybody has realized that because we're just so busy working relentlessly that ultimately we don't even realize that things might have changed a little bit. From my perspective, obviously, working a lot across the industries in supply chain, sometimes I try to take a bit of an helicopter view and
Mhm.
just assess really what is going on in the market. And my research is showing that today the future we're living is something that we could really call industry 5.0 as opposed to the traditional industry 4.0. We're now industry 5.0. That is a sort of like era where the focus is not just and not primarily digitization, which of course is going to be there. It's going to be a bit of sort of like underlying, almost a backbone, okay, so to speak.
Mhm.
So that's obviously not disappearing because clearly technology keeps on evolving, and as such, companies keep on digitizing and kind of like transforming their operations. But when we think about Industry 5.0, there are at least three pillars to be taken into account. The first one is the human element. Why? Because effectively, with in the past few years, the focus has been greatly over optimizing operations, increasing efficiency, creating end-to-end visibility. But all of these activities, irrespective of the type of technology that was being implemented, had a clear focus that was an internal focus. So Industry 4.0, to a very large degree, has been an inward-looking type of era, whereby companies were trying to optimize the operation. And I think as we move along into this new era that we are already in, effectively, as I mentioned before, the focus is really about putting the human element at the center. And what
Mhm.
does that mean? It means two things, effectively. On one side, it means reshaping all of the processes really as a function of the customer experience. If you think, I work a lot with the life science industry, where the customer is effectively a patient. So,
Mhm.
reshaping, for example, in pharma, their pharma processes to make them really patient-centric, to put the patient journey at the very core of everything that is being done. And the other element is still with relation to the human aspect of Industry 5.0 is the internal side, employees. So um, to give you a concrete, tangible example, there's been a lot of talks, a lot of considerations, ethics concerns also with regard to the role of artificial intelligence and how it is possibly threatening the workforce. The reality is that Industry 5.0 looks at digitization as a process of transformation that puts the machines by the side of the human being, the really human being, that the very humans that are actually operating those machines.
Mhm.
So effectively, it's machines serving human, not replacing them. That's the first aspect of Industry 5.0. Second point is resilience. Okay, resilience is something that clearly became extremely prominent, particularly around 2020 when we all experienced COVID-19, and an event that no one from our generation will ever be able to forget, but that effectively changed and reshaped a little bit the conversation. Even there were discussions, I remember very clearly back then, whether lean supply chains would make sense anymore. And they do make sense. The point is that you need to be lean in a smart way, in a reasonable way, and in a resilient way. If that means that sometimes you need to have dual sourcing as opposed to sole sourcing, that's actually something that comes with a price tag, with a cost, and that's just one example. But here it's all about taking a business case that is truly holistic, and that therefore takes into account not just the cost of being more resilient, but also the potential costs you would incur if you were not resilient, something that many
Yes.
companies, unfortunately, during COVID-19 experienced. And then I mentioned there's a third element to Industry 5.0, and that's the sustainability bit. Sustainability, again, it's something that effectively we are inheriting from the last few years, but that's becoming even more prominent because I think the key difference between Industry 4.0 and Industry 5.0 is the fact that Industry 5.0 takes humanity much more into account. For besides the human element that I mentioned before, there is also a bit of a social responsibility that the industry and all industries are supposed to be taken under the Industry 5.0 framework. So these are things that are already happening, and many people might have not labeled like that, like Industry 5.0. I'm sure that in the span of not long, really, we'll start talking more broadly about Industry 5.0. But that's effectively a different kind of transformation that is happening in the industry, and that it's radically changing the way even digitization is being looked at. Because, as I mentioned before, we're moving from a very, very inward-centered perspective to a more outward-focused perspective.
Yeah, this is like a very interesting points that you were mentioning, Mirko, regarding like moving from 4.0 industry into 5.0 industry, and like these three distinctions that you highlighted regarding like exactly the essence of this difference is really something completely different, I believe, that most of the industry is currently focusing on, because as you mentioned, mostly the companies, the supply chain in generally, this is more like internal centric processes. And as you mentioned, with the 5.0 industry, the focus will be more on the people, on the customer experience. And that is why digitalization processes, this should be like in most of the companies, they should be like completely rethinked. And that is why will be changed in terms how the supply chains actually operate, how the businesses operate, what the decisions they will be making, what the priorities they will be making. And that is why, yeah, as I totally agree with you, digitalizations will be like a backbone of all these processes, but the focus will be on different. And that is why I believe that we are like moving into a little bit different phase, different era right now. Yeah. So that was like really interesting point here. And now moving on to one of the most interesting contradictions, I believe, in the market that exists right now is that companies that have already invested in the systems, in the visibility tools and data platforms, yet they still have these kind of issues, then the disruption happens. So that is why decision is still often slow or fragmented. And I'm really wondering, why do you think that gap still exists with all this money invested in the data tools and all the stuff?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. We were discussing briefly, before starting the recording about the conference event I attended this week, and there were a lot of conversation about data and actionability of the data, and really like usability of the data. Because of course, when it comes to not surprisingly, many of the conversations revolved around agentic AI and any sort of like digitalization process, particularly those that relate to artificial intelligence implementation, clearly require very, very strong foundation of data. Data per se is not a problem. At least it's not a problem that has the same vastity as it used to be a few years ago. So there is, a much greater amount of data now, which is
Mhm.
fantastic. The problem is that data per se are nothing but figures. So they need to be actionable. They need to be really usable, and that's where this sort of gap that you were mentioning still exists. You have data, and yet you don't have visibility. It sounds like a contradiction, Unfortunately, it's reality. There are many reasons why this happens, really. So one is the integration complexity. Of course, integration is one of the top barriers in many of the conversations I've been having. Many supply chain professional fellows they mentioned this integration as a key source of concern, because the moment you are missing that integration across different systems, you have effectively platforms that don't communicate, and this unavoidably creates data silos that lead
Mhm.
to inaccurate information and potentially kind of like misguided actions to an extent. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that you cannot use data in isolation to create visibility if you don't have also according process or set of internal processes. So there's something that hasn't changed over the years, that when you look at business processes in general, you need to consider processes, organizations, and systems. So the organizations need to be set up according to the real requirements. The process need to be reshaped in line with the organization and the new tools. And finally, the systems need to support this organization and process that we just mentioned. So as long as the process is misaligned, clearly the pursuit for true visibility is something that will continue because you cannot reach it. And in relation to that, there is organizational fragmentation, because
Yeah.
we said before, if there is, at the beginning, I mentioned the integration barriers, integration complexity. Well, the reality is that integration complexity, when systems are not integrated, they create silos and data silos and misalignment, and it works exactly the same with the whole organizational setup, people, how people are organized. Um, Even the sort of like digitization initiatives sometimes are being dealt with as IT projects, whereas in reality they are business projects, where the component of IT is critical because they are the enablers, but the sort of like owner of that project should be somebody from the business, somebody who understands the functional requirements and can really shape the way the tool or the system is being deployed. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, and this leads to a number of issues, including some innate resistance to change. And then the other element is that when we talk about organization, we cannot ignore or disregard the aspect of talent and skill gaps, because with processes and systems that are evolving that fast, you need to really retrain constantly your workforce, or sometimes we kind of face a bit of a generational gap issue, whereas certain like a big base of employees are used to work in a certain manner, and they might not necessarily have the right mindset to adopt new process and to adapt to the new systems.
Yes.
When that is the case, unfortunately, that's the moment where organizations need to and companies need to make tough decisions, which is leading to something that you might have heard before, which is like they say, don't worry about AI stealing your job. Worry about somebody who knows how to use AI stealing your
Yeah.
job. It's a simplification, but that's something that does not only apply to AI. It really applies to your ability to change as a skilled and flexible employee, skilled and flexible worker, somebody who can easily adopt new mindsets and be open-minded enough to embrace new ways of working, even though unavoidably this create discomfort at the beginning, because it's so much easier to stay in your comfort zone and work the way you always done. The problem is that that way is going to disappear. So do you want
Yeah.
to disappear, or do you want to stay? And I guess most of us want to stay, and that means that you need to be able to adapt. I just want to mention another point, which is interesting. I mean, it might not be the most charming of all, but it's just so important, which is measurements. So, like creating KPIs to even demonstrate that visibility and those new digital tools have led to some benefit, is something that is so important. Large portion of executives actually they struggle to prove the value of the disruptions that, for example, that they avoided by the usage of new tools, by thanks to this visibility. I mean, sometimes it's not just about cost savings or direct cost savings. Sometimes it's about cost avoidance. That's much harder to prove. So if you don't start with the end in mind, if you don't start with already the idea of how I'm going to measure that this initiative is successful, it's going to be difficult down the line to defend the initiative, to defend the system, to defend the tool, to defend new investments into something that is a bit unknown. A lot of the work I do with my clients goes really in the direction also of creating sound business cases that
Mhm.
are really sometimes requiring a lot of brainstorming, a lot of creativity in understanding which kind of perspective, which kind of direction to take, because it's always difficult with things that are new, that don't have historical data to basically measure their success. But that's exactly where it becomes most important, because it's what allows you to keep investing effort, time, money into those initiatives, and always play the role of the pioneer, which gives you a clear advantage of the first mover. That's the
Mhm.
space where you want to play. You want to be there, the first doing something, because you know you're going to make some mistakes. It's going to be not perfect, but compared to being follower, it gives you an extra advantage, because you being the first one gives you a bit of an extra edge.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree with you. And this is like really great how you explain all of it and all the points that you highlighted, why the technology is not always automatically creates the clarity and better decisions, because everything depends on how your company is structured, how your processes are structured, how the people are prepared for the new technologies that you usually introduce into your processes. So that is why that's always like the issues that all that you highlighted. This is exactly the reason why this gap still exists, and that is why, as you mentioned, so you need to work in all of these directions in order to enable all like the best of the technologies that you have. So that is why they will be able to provide you more visibility on the areas that you need. So that is why you will be able to make like decisions faster and more effectively. So that is why I totally agree on this direction. And of course, like even from the perspective of the company structure, the governance within the company, all this is everything that pretty crucial in this direction. So then moving forward also in the direction of the data. So we hear a lot all the time that the data is the foundation of this transformation. Yeah. But in reality, I believe like not all data is equally valuable, and sometimes it creates like insight, sometimes it creates just noise, like extra information that you just do not need. And that is why, what do you think, what makes data smart in supply chain context? How does that change the quality of the decisions?
Yeah. Not all data is created equal. Okay, that's that's for sure. And in my experience, I remember up until maybe 5, 6 years ago, we were talking a lot about big data, and not everybody had really a sense of what big data was back then. And I think today we're much clearer over what big data is, and we're also much clearer about the fact that big data and smart data is two completely different things.
Yes.
Smart data is something that is actually very much oriented towards a focus, and the difference really between big data and smart data is effectively the difference between noise and actionable insights. So for data to be smart, that means to be really useful, they need to be obviously accurate. They need to be timely, which doesn't mean necessarily real time. Let's be
Mhm.
careful on this. I mean, it means timely means time bound to the necessity of the process of the company. So let's not really eat our brains over trying to reach real-time data when maybe we have data that come 24 hours later and they are perfectly usable. Okay, it
Mhm.
really depends on the processes, but let's not
Yeah.
just pursue the sacred growl for no reasons. So we said accurate, we said timely. We also need to consider that smart data, or let's say that data becomes smart also when they are contextualized. So they need to be specific to a context and context to a specific need. And clearly, the feature that for me is probably the most important of all four, they need to be actionable. So it's data that is governed, it's data that is enriched. Most important is data that is embedded in the decision workflows. Okay, and this is the only way this data can possibly enable the predictive and prescriptive analytics, which is ultimately what everybody is really looking for when it comes to data. So we don't just need descriptive reporting because then it's like having too much noise, and too much information equals no information at all. So the key distinction, I would say, is not how much data we have, but most importantly, which decisions are we able to make thanks to this data, and therefore, which decisions are enabled by this data, and how quickly, how fast, because there's again the time element that is so critical. So the companies that are going to win this space, or the ones that are already winning in this space, we're not talking about something futuristic here, are effectively those that can turn data into actions and do that quite rapidly.
Yeah.
And they can do that also reliably, so because of accuracy, and also they can scale up accordingly, because obviously I don't think you need a crystal ball to understand that the amount of data that are going to kick in is just going to increase. I mean, it's only going in one direction. The direction is the amount of data is growing, is increasing, and therefore the ability to process data becomes absolutely critical. I mean, to make a point here, of course, we are still at a very early stage, but clearly quantum computing and on all digitals that will be, sorry, all digital technologies that will be quantum computing based
Mhm.
will really base themselves on this idea of having incredible processing capabilities, things that today we can't even imagine because we haven't seen that, and yet there are already pilots, quantum computing pilots.
Yes, yes.
So I don't think we are even too far away from that, but we're not yet there. Okay, that's fine. But the point is, why do we even need quantum computing? Because effectively, it's like a technology push there, but that will lead us to a brand new world where, even if we think about our laptops that we are just connecting from right now, I mean, this would be the comparison between much like, let me say this. Today we have more technology in our smartphones than there was in the NASA computers that launched the first man to the moon.
Yeah.
And that's, I believe, the same order of magnitude. Technology today, as we know it, would be absolutely minimal compared to what quantum computing would enable. So coming back to the data, you can imagine that the computing capabilities in future will have a processing ability that will enable real smart data. So, and that's the future where you could see a much greater impact of autonomous machine capable of taking complex decisions, whereby only a residual part,
Mhm.
yet important, but just residual, will be left to the human expertise, the one that cannot be covered by the machine.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, this is like really interesting points, Mirko, that you highlighted, starting with like actually getting the data and the information valuable for the making of the decisions. And I believe, totally agree with you that the quantum computing, this is not something like really futuristic right now, because we already, as you mentioned, have the pilots that are work in this direction. I believe from that perspective, we will have a much deeper understanding of the data and much greater insights from the perspective of the actionability of this information, how we can work with this. And of course, moving forward with making some of the basic decisions, some of them like most clear information that we have, and the information that we can use for the decisions in that period of time, like maybe in 5-10 years, will be able to be done by these machines. And that is why human intervention will be needed much less. So that is why this is completely another world, as you mentioned, that we will be entering. And that is why already with the agentic AIs, I believe some of the actions are already done automatically. But that's I believe really maybe 0.00% of all the activities that could be done in supply chain automatically. But I believe with quantum computing and other technologies, these processes could be more automated. But of course, it also really depends on how the company is structured, how the governance is structured as well. Because in some companies, they are too fragmented, and that is why it will be difficult to make some automated decisions by some bot or something like this without pretty let's say unified approach within the departments within the company itself. So that is why that's really interesting points that we touched in this question. And then moving forward into our next question that I have for you, Mirka, is regarding the supply chains that are currently becoming more global, more interconnected, companies working across more markets, more partners, more technologies than ever it was before. On paper, the visibility has improved, but in practice, connected decision-making processes are still very difficult. And I was wondering, why does true connected decision-making remain so hard to achieve?
In a word, that's say lack of trust. 3 words. I had a very interesting panel I moderated this week on suppliers ecosystem within the medtech industry.
Mhm.
And that's just one example. I mean, that's recurring across many industries. And in the interactive part of the panel, we had a few suppliers there in the room, and they pointed out, because we got to the point of data sharing and collaboration and true partnerships rather than just transactional relationship. They mentioned, but the reality is that we don't even have enough visibility. We don't get enough data from our clients to be able to really even just plan our work in an effective manner. And that is a plague. I mean, the lack, let's say the kind of concern over data sharing, reluctance to sharing data sovereignty. It's something that is really impairing any effort done towards improved visibility and true connected end-to-end decision making. Companies are hesitant to share their data. It's just as simple as that. And this is true irrespective of any NDAs, long-term contract clauses and penalties that might exist. They're reluctant to do so because there is a fundamental inherent lack of trust, which makes me think of the kind of huge chance we all missed with blockchain. Because blockchain in supply chain came by now maybe 10, 12, 13 years ago with loads of promises, but they were missed. They came short. I mean, blockchain came short of expectations, unfortunately. And to make this case more compelling, when I say more compelling, even one of the most important pilots, example of blockchain usage in supply chain deployment done by Maersk together with IBM, the Trade Lens initiative. Fantastic. But unfortunately, despite the technological sophistication, it was dismissed in 2023 because there was ecosystem resistance and reluctance to share data. Even in the blockchain framework, that is supposedly the safest environment to share data. So we can be as sophisticated as we want, but as long as data are not being shared openly, freely, we'll keep talking about the pursuit for end-to-end visibility without ever being able to reach it. Take that together with the fact that there are problems with system interoperability. Okay, something we touched upon even before when we talked about complexity or integration. Take that in conjunction with also the fact that because of complexity and administration, very often the visibility stops at the tier one, upstream or downstream, but stops at the first, let's say, the first supplier. And very often the problems are actually happening at the following tiers. That, guess what, are those that are serving all different companies. We might be working very closely and have very great visibility with our contract manufacturer. Maybe they source their components from another supplier where all contract manufacturers are sourcing from, so there is a bottleneck there.
Mm-hmm.
And you think you have a great visibility over your operations because you know what's happening at the contract manufacturer. Maybe you have even sophisticated models, vendor managed inventory, etc., but you're not seeing what's happening and the sort of like trend that is happening upstream, 2 levels up. Yeah, basically you have no real end-to-end visibility. So, I mean, end-to-end visibility goes way, way beyond just those nodes of supply chain that we're in touch with. And so, all of those are just elements. For me, honestly, if we only were to focus on one, that would be, in my book, that would be the data sharing aspect. So reducing the reluctance to sharing data, and that would make a huge difference in achieving true end-to-end visibility and connected decision making. Because decision
Yeah.
making, connected decision making, is not a technology problem, or not just a technology problem, but it's mostly a trust and organizational problem. And there are many other elements. I mean, we can not touch possibly all of them because otherwise we'll keep going for another 2 hours at least.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, yeah, like valuable points that you highlighted right now. Yeah, especially like the lack of trust. I believe this is like the main reason for this kind of, let's say, gap that exists regarding the connected decisions, connecting interoperability between the companies and throughout the supply chain, especially. Yeah, so that is why visibility, this is like the key part for this kind of connected cooperation. But yeah, as data is something that people not really eager to share, this issue will stay. So that is why I really agree with you with the point regarding the blockchain technology and the possibility to share the data between the partners, between the stakeholders securely. And unfortunately, we didn't use it yet, like in the industry in general, didn't utilize it in the full capacity of it. So that is why maybe in the future people will start getting big to this idea. So that is why there will be more easier ways to share the data, more secure ways to share it, and that is why there will be the possibility to connect the signals, align the stakeholders, yeah, and make the decisions like more coordinated across the whole network that we have. But maybe in future, yeah, we'll see this kind of blockchain getting back in supply chain, yeah. So moving ahead to our last question that I have for today, it feels like reaching a point where like simply adding more tools and, as we mentioned, like new visibility tools that companies are using will no longer will be enough. Some companies will clearly move ahead with this kind of utilization of the technologies, and some other companies may still stuck despite the ongoing investment in the technology. So what do you think will separate these companies that like truly transform from those that simply kept adding more technology? What will be the difference, where it come down to the data, operating model, leadership mindset, let's say, or something else?
It boils down to the traditional problem of avoiding the risk of chasing a solution looking for problems, if you know what I mean. So basically, first and foremost, it is absolutely critical to only invest and explore technologies whereby there is a clear problem statement, or where there is a clear business need, not just because everybody else is doing that and therefore you cannot afford to be left behind, because otherwise your board will be questioning you, or why are you not doing that? Well, because
Yeah,
because I
yeah, yeah.
don't need it. It's just as simple as that. But aside from that, I think there is the transformation in general, even digital transformation, is something that, again, it's not just a technological matter, but it's a way more composite type of question, because it includes elements such as the operating model redesign, because clearly, you need to re-architect your processes to kind of like accommodate these new ways of working, and even, I would say, new ways of creating value. Okay, so that's really something that goes hand in hand with the deployment of a new technology. The other thing is the leadership mindset, because clearly the most transformative supply chain executive, and let me say supply chain leaders, well, are those that effectively take a cross-functional approach, whereby the ultimate goal, the ultimate objective is not to optimize the operation to reduce costs, but effectively to improve the if you want to be really, really dry, I would say to improve the profitability of the company. Trust me, I've been, for many years, I've been working in corporate, and it was never easy to to sell to my own management projects that increased our supply chain costs. Yet, in some cases, that increase in costs enables a threefold or tenfold increase
Yeah.
in the top line. So if you really want to look at the business case, you need to look at it end to end. You cannot look at it in a siloed manner. And that applies broadly to the leadership mindset. Really, if you think about Apple, for example, where supply chain reports directly to the CEO by the CSCO, the Chief Supply Chain Officer. Well, the supply chain there is led in accordance with the specific business needs, and that creates obviously an excellence in terms of how activities are executed. I also believe that must be robust data strategy, meaning laying end-to-end data foundations that really enable those smart data that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
And that clearly starts with rudimental activities, yet so important, such as, for example, master data harmonization for consistency. It starts from breaking down the silos that might exist across different systems, therefore enabling true integration across all company systems, so that,
Yeah.
that you reach a single version of the truth when it comes to data. Because the worst part is when you have different figures for the same element, that can drive you nuts, really, and it's really something that would enable any system, any digital system to be deployed effectively. And last but not least, once again, but forgive me for that, because I'm a little bit obsessed with people, and even my activities are all human centered. So I guess I'm very much in line with Industry 5.0 we were talking about before.
Yeah.
It's talent. The talent that is required to basically enable this true technological transformation is made out of people that come with different skill sets, not just ready to enable this digital and to embrace these digital technologies, but also people who are capable of having a cross-functional view. Therefore, even if you think about project teams, being able to mix people with a more commercial background with people with a more technical background and a more functional background, and clearly that goes hand in hand with guaranteeing a bit of a continuous upskilling, training, and really even having an underlying capability building roadmap for the foreseeable future, so that like training and upskilling is not a one-off activity. That must
Yeah.
be understood, because as technology evolves, so do processes, and so must people. Therefore, you need to have like a multi-year plan that, to although we know that there is turnover in the workforce, effectively you might want to have a upskilling plan that is at least lasting as long as your strategy roadmap, at
Yeah.
least.
At
Ideally,
least,
you
yes.
want to have it for the whole employment of the person in the company, which you don't know how long that is going to be, but potentially could last as long as 30 years. Probably not nowadays, but I mean, and clearly it's impossible to foresee and to forecast what's going to be needed even in 5 years from now. But under this constraint, at least let's make sure that at the very bare minimum, strategy roadmap and capability upskilling roadmap are aligned from a timing perspective.
Yeah, that's true. So actually, this is like a really powerful way to close the conversation, because from the perspective that you highlighted and the points that you highlighted in your answer regarding like the transformation, this is something that is not just technology adoption and maybe like picking out what technology will solve your problem. Yes, so this is like much deeper analysis that should be done before you even start to check in the solutions on the market or start building something. Yes, so this is how the organization think. Yeah, how the organizations are led, what are the workforce that is capable of, let's say, working with these new technologies. So maybe there is the need for the specific training. And as you mentioned, this is something that should be adjusted and done throughout the whole process of the employment of the people within the company. So that is why that's everything that contribute to the part if you will be like the company in general will be able to onboard new technology and utilize this technology effectively. So that is why it's like pretty complex questions that we discussed today. And thank you, Mirko, very much for sharing your insights and your vision on these questions and these topics. This was like really thoughtful conversation, and I think that one thing that made very clear is the next chapter of supply chain transformation is not only just like about digitizing the operations, it's more about the supply chains that will need to be connected and challenge like intelligent and capable of making better decisions in much more complex worlds through the technologies, through the leadership, through the governance, through the people who are working within these companies. So that is why thank you very much. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with some people who are interested in the future of the supply chains, logistics, and transformation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you, Victoria. Thanks for having me.